Welcome, everybody. Also those online. Hopefully, everything goes well. The acoustic in this room is a bit blurred, but okay. So we are very happy today to welcome Philip Lane. Giancarlo will say a few words introducing him in just in a moment. As to me, just recall that this is part of the EMU Lab, which is an initiative by now many of you know. We have launched some time ago as a joint endeavor of the Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa Chair, so myself and the Pierre Werner Chair, Giancarlo. We have an internal steering board. We have an advisory committee with academic, policymakers, market participants. We are just out of 2 weeks ago, of a major 2-day workshop for the preparation of what we have called the Florence Report, that we aim at issuing, say, by the end of the year or so, with the overarching topic being fragmentation and policy space. When we started with this idea, fragmentation in Giancarlo and myself mind was essentially internal to the EU and the Eurozone. And, cataclysmic events have taken place in the meantime. So now there is clearly looming large external fragmentation. So there's the external fragmentation, and with the arrow potentially going from the external to the internal and possibly back again. So we have to reconfigure a bit the conceptual framework, making it, even more challenging and interesting. So this is a bit the overall framework of our reflections, and we have many events that contribute to provide the intellectual backbone for this analytical work. And today's lecture is one of them. Let's just finish by recalling the next events. We are going to have next week Federico Fabbrini on Trump and EU governance. Then we have on the 3rd of June Odile Renaud-Basso, who is president of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, who is coming over. That would be more of a conversation rather than a full lecture. And we go back to the lecture mode on the 19th of June with one of Philip's colleagues, François Villeroy de Galhau, who is president of the governor of the Central Bank of France. So just write down for your diary, 29th, Federico Fabbrini, 3rd of June, Odile Renaud-Basso, and the 19th, François Villeroy de Galhau. And we are going to also organize in the next weeks a number of webinars, and stay tuned for that. These will be a more agile type of events that we are going to involve you in. Okay, Giancarlo.
Yeah. Good morning. Welcome, everybody, both online and in presence. Let me start saying that we are fortunate and pleased to have Phil Lane again here at the UI with this lecture, this time for the EMU Lab lecture series. As you know, Phil is a member of the Executive Board of the ECB since 2019, before he was governor of the Bank of Ireland between 2015 and 2019. Where to start? We know each other since ever, I guess, since we were fresh out of school. Let me say that he's an international monetary and real economist at the ECB board. And as such, I think that his work testifies how rigorous academic work can actually be put in place and influence and guide policy decision-making with impact, positive impact at societal level. And in retrospective, when I look at what Phil did over his career, this is the feature of Phil work. Always throughout his career, share the feature of having positive spillover impact service to society, that being the group of academics in economics, that being Irish academic and society, that being the Euro area. I just want to flash out to point one of his leading contribution, the data set on the external wealth of nation Phil developed with Milesi Ferretti. Is still today, after many, many years, a vital data set used to work in international economic as a reliable source of accurate information about the state of international portfolios and external imbalances. And today, accurate, reliable information is gold standard now to discipline the debate and the decision-making process. I don't have the time to elaborate on that, but there is also a Phil as an Irishman, and I think the contribution of Phil to Ireland academic and society should also be praised, where he, after teaching at the SIPA school in Columbia, upon graduation from Harvard, after a few years, he moved back to Ireland, where I think that he gave a fundamental contribution to the structural development of Irish academic work. I don't rely on this on Wikipedia. I rely on this on many of my Irish students, excellent Irish students that cannot help but praise, feel fingerprints, long-lasting impact on the state of the Trinity College, and more in general, the community of academics in Ireland. So I stop here. We are happy now to listen to Phil elaborating on inflation, disinflation in the Euro area.
And thank you, Marco. Thank you, Giancarlo. And before I jump into the topic, maybe it's worthwhile to take a wider perspective, because I'm happy to hear that the Florence report is taking on the topic of fragmentation and policy space, because I mean, I do think it's very important, both within the area and also from a global perspective. And indeed, coming from Ireland, you know, I spent plenty of time thinking about what does it mean to be a small open economy in a wider monetary union. And I think when I look at the audience, not all of you will have the historical memory of what Europe looked like before the euro. And it's important always to remember the relevant counterfactual is, with all of what's going on in the world, how would Europe be dealing with it with 19 extra currencies? And I think by and large, having 19 extra currencies would not be healthy dealing with global challenges. So it's a major, I think, achievement. We have to run it properly. The member states have to understand what it means to be part of a monetary union. But as a really amazing innovation, you know, I think that's very important. And Giancarlo may not know it, but there's a direct causal link from Giancarlo to where I am today, because actually I finished my PhD in 1995. My PhD actually was open economy macro, but it wasn't particularly European focused. In fact, my job market paper was inflation in open economies, but without a European context. But actually, I heard a paper that was written by Willem Boyter, Giancarlo, and Paolo Presenti, a center periphery model of monetary coordination and exchange rate crises, which is pointing out, at that point in time, the Bundesbank was the anchor of the European monetary system. And this system, which we had before, which is other countries essentially having to align with the Bundesbank, but without having co-decision-making power, was inherently fragile. And actually, I developed some applied papers coming out of that, which is my kind of academic entry in thinking about the euro. And then with Marco, I don't know if Marco remembered this project from 20 years ago. Now, the full project I don't quite recall, but I do recall for myself my assignment within that book project was to work out how to make policymaking under uncertainty. So do you remember this project? So Marco led that and he invited me to participate. And actually today I'm still dealing with policymaking under uncertainty. But I think maybe, and again, for those of you who are doing research, people have very short memories. I'm pretty sure the citation rate for papers dies very quickly. So you're looking at, well, someone said something in 2024, 2023, but actually a lot of time you can go back many years and you can actually reinventing what people worked out and updating can often be effective. In any event, having said all of that, and also, of course, as you know, the EUI and the ECB share, we're in the same family of institutions. There's many EUI graduates at the ECB, including at the most senior levels. And I'm fairly sure in what I'm going to present to you today, there's plenty of EUI fingerprints in terms of the underlying work that's behind some of these charts. So what I want to do is review the last few years, again, from an analytical perspective and also from a real-time perspective. Because, you know, amazingly, I meet people all the time who tell me they knew with certainty what was about to happen. And I'll try and explain, okay, amazing, fantastic, but this is what we were thinking at the time, including from a risk management perspective. And so it's very important, these episodes don't come along very often. And so it's fantastic for research, because I mean, when I joined the ECB in June 2019, we had coming out of a decade of the inflation being incredibly stable around 1%. So if you're working on inflation, there's not much you can do when the left-hand side variable is 1.0 all the time. Whereas now we've had a lot of variation in inflation, and it's actually what people were writing about when inflation was high was incomplete. They say, okay, let's how this plays out. And now inflation's nearly back to 2%. So you have a full cycle now. So understanding how to think about that cycle of inflation is going to feed many dissertations for many years. And in the same way the 1930s has dominated macro research, the global financial crisis has dominated macro research. At this point, it's in my rear view mirror as a policymaker, but it should be in your data sets now for academic research for quite a long time. Okay, so let me first of all talk about our response before going to inflation. And what you see here is, you know, in 2012, the ECB brought the interest rate to 0, and then in kind of a bit by bit step, we went increasingly negative. So in 2019, the policy rate was minus 0.5. And you see those, okay, we started raising rates in mid-22. So we had a decade of 0 or below 0 interest rates. And so much effort was put into understanding 0 versus minus 50, chopping up into 10 basis points. All of that disappeared very quickly when we went from minus 50 to plus 400. And you know, this is a really big tightening in the context of the euro area. Not historically, 450 basis points is not historically a kind of exceptional tightening, but compared to where we were, it was a major change in the financial system. And let me maybe emphasize, maybe the most interesting element to this is the market has a rock solid belief that essentially the steady state interest rate is around 2. So the market, the solid blue line at the end is the market pricing of what they expect to come up. And, you know, there's a debate about maybe we'll go a little bit below 2% in the near term, but not for very long. So the steady state is expected to be around 2%. So the market in 2019, even in 2021, was convinced, for as far as the eye could see, the policy rate would be 0 or negative. At the end of, even the end of 21, End of 2019, the kind of 2-year ahead expected inflation was 1.5. 2-year ahead expected inflation now is more or less 2. So it's basically saying we're going from a steady state real interest rate of -2 to 0. So about 200 basis points of real interest rate increase open-ended. So if you're trying to reprice an asset, 200 basis points steady state increase in the interest rate is pretty big. And when you think about asset pricing, credit volumes, and so on, that's pretty big. I mean, for me, I think maybe there's people like Ken Rogoff, others write about trends in real exchange rates or real interest rates. And of course, real exchange rates matter as well. But for me, I think the way to interpret it is we were providing a lot of accommodation. We were holding down interest rates quite a bit. And now they're bouncing back to maybe a more natural equilibrium. And this has a lot of long-term consequences. So anyway, that's, I'm not going to dwell on that element too much. And then the other element of when inflation was so low and when interest rates were already negative, we did a lot of balance sheet policies. And in the European context, they had 2 types. One was QE, to buy bonds. And we bought bonds under this asset pricing program and in the pandemic under the PEP, which is a more flexible program. So you see here, the sum of those 2 at the peak, the red and the blue, got to nearly 5 trillion euro. And then we added 2 trillion on top of that in TLTROs, basically targeted lending to the banking system. So at the peak, our monetary policy portfolios were around 7 trillion euro. Now, I know you all carry around, okay, how big is, well, maybe I'm not going to do the survey because to ask you, okay, how big is the euro area economy in nominal euro terms? You should know that, by the way, but I know people don't. I was shocked when I started at Harvard and all these amazing people, and no one had a clue how big the American economy was. Because from a practical point of view, academics don't need to know that. But it's important that you know that 7 trillion euro at that time was 44% of your area GDP. So in terms of the stock of bonds we bought and the TLTROs, that's not a small number. And that maybe illustrates the role of the central bank can be very big in the bond market and in the banking system. In any event, the reason to do that mostly is when interest rates are too low, you have to turn to other ways to expand monetary support. But now we've been raising interest rates, we're shrinking those portfolios, so they've come down quite a bit, with more to come. I'm happy later on, if you have questions about policy setting, to talk about it. And I will come to it to some extent, but I'm mostly going to focus on the dynamics of inflation. Okay, so you might say, you know, if you give me a single time series like euro area inflation, how do I think about it? And of course, you can go a long way with, you know, a single time series, but it's also helpful to put into a panel context. So the BIS made a big effort to build a data set of inflation spikes over many decades. So this has 58 countries in this data. And by the way, all these slides are on the ECB website, so you can also see them there. And so the shaded area is the typical inflation disinflation episodes. So the typical one, if I look at the red line, which is the median, it's a surge of 4 percentage points. So it goes to -4. So the 0 is defined as the peak. So you have an initial surge of 4 percentage points, and then it reverts. That 4 disinflates over time. So compare, and then this is, I think, the interquartile range, I would guess, is the shaded area. But Yeah, interquartile. So you see the shaded area is the interquartile range. So you see this episode was outside of that typical distribution. What we had was basically around an 11 percentage point surge in inflation, from slightly negative to 10.6 in October 22. So that's a very rapid increase in inflation. But what's also true is the disinflation has been fairly rapid as well. That's also been outside the historical distribution. So some people look at that blue line, and it's not quite the season to say it here, but and basically call it a Christmas tree. It looks like a Christmas tree, like it goes up and then it comes down. But maybe, and crucially in your area, it's not coming all the way down back to where it was, which is inflation rate 1.0 kind of level. It's coming back down to where we want it to be, around 2. So one of the features that matter for us, it matters for Japan, it doesn't matter so much for the US, is there's been a side effect of what happened is there's been a re-anchoring of inflation around the 2% target. So before the pandemic, there was so much discussion about de-anchoring to the downside, Europe turning into Japan, the lower bound, meaning there's not much we can do. And what we've learned is a shock, an exogenous shock can bounce you out of that. I'm not saying there's a welfare improving move to let this happen, but the side effect is we now have a discussion of inflation around the anchor. Okay, you might say, okay, up and down, that's just energy prices going up and down. Show me core. So on the right side, I look at core inflation. First of all, I should say, it's not obvious core inflation is a well-defined concept. This is goods and services. The reason why people do it is they think energy and food is so volatile, you should look through that. I'm going to come back to that point, but maybe what you see here is the surge in core was also outside the historical norm. But what's maybe interesting is the disinflation in core has not been as rapid.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, the y-axis is different.
Yeah. But I mean, obviously,
So, I mean, it gives from far away. I don't know if you can spot it, but it gives an impression that is actually the dispersion is wider in the core inflation, but it's not the case.
So the fluctuation, of course, would be less. You don't have this kind of gigantic increase in gas prices. There's nothing in the core inflation is going to be like that. But within the, and this is why the BIS panel is interesting, because it gives you a relevant scaling factor, which is the historical typically pattern. So compared to the historical typical pattern, it's was a very rapid increase in core, but then the disinflation has been less. So, okay, so within core, I think conceptually it's better to differentiate goods inflation and services inflation. And again, for a macro modeler, this is not too far away from having a traded sector and a non-traded sector. So having, and this is was a foundation for my own PhD work, was to say essentially inflation rates fundamentally differ between traded and non-traded. So what you see here is for goods inflation, rapid up, rapid down. So you do have that kind of very, very rapid cycle. Whereas for services inflation, it went up fairly quickly and it's remaining relatively high. Now we think forward looking, it's going to come down, but the dynamics quite different. And so again, when you think about persistence in inflation, if you think about wage price dynamics, if you think about how does a shock perpetuate, all of these graphs tell you where you need to look is the services sector. I mean, there's two basic reasons why goods inflation came down quickly. One is that the surge was very connected to bottlenecks. So the bottleneck issue at the time we thought was unique to the pandemic. that we basically had this massive switch in spending from services because you couldn't go out and consume services, but people wanted to order the exercise bike, order a home office, and so on. So in 2020, there's this really big change in spending towards goods. And then in 22, when the European economy reopened, people had enough exercise bikes, and what they really wanted to do is go on holiday and go back to restaurants and have normal life. So there's a big rotation towards services inflation. So about a month ago at the Brookings panel, Stock and Watson, who are the kind of masters of business cycle time series, asked, how do I incorporate the pandemic into our time series models? And they basically found that all you need to do is have the relative price of goods versus services in your data set. And that's a perfect proxy for the weird stuff in the pandemic. So basically there's a lot of papers at the time with sectoral shocks. So Ivan Werning, Veronica Guerrieri, Lorenzo, many people were writing about that, Lorenzoni. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that, but move on. Okay, so you might say, you've shown me pictures about inflation. From a macro point of view, does the inflation dynamic correlate with the real economy? And this is the picture for euro area GDP and its components. So of course, you have the V shape in 2020 when there's a very rapid shutdown of the European economy and the global economy in Q2 of 2020. So if here the scaling factors, everything's set to 100 at the end of 2019. If you look at consumption, which is the orange line, it's barely above 100. If you look at investment, which is the red line, it's barely above 100. So what you have to think about is, how does inflation happen if you don't really have much of a demand boom? I mean, demand did bounce back from the bottom. So they didn't stay at the very low 2020 levels. And if you look at the graph for consumption, you see in the course of 2021, so you go from Q1 21 to mid 22, you do have like a 10 percentage point increase in consumption. So if you do a simple-minded BAR, you are going to find a role for the surge in consumption. But the question is, semantically, is there a difference between consumption recovering from a very low number to a number that's only recovering to the pre-pandemic level? Do you call that a demand boom, or do you call it recovery in demand? And I think the answer is, in that time, demand recovered. Of course, the supply side of the economy was very constrained with bottlenecks and so on. And it's only in around March 22 where the full reopening of the EU area economy from lockdowns happening. Because was it the Omicron variant in late 21, early 22 led to another lockdown. So from the econometric point of view, Q2 22 is very tricky because we had this reopening of the European economy at exactly the same time as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ramon, please.
You probably are familiar too with this picture for the United States. It's slightly different.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will come to a kind of global decomposition, and there is a role for global demand. Because of course the US didn't just have a consumption recovering, consumption went like 20% above the, so I don't disagree. Globally, there was a stronger role for demand. But of course, from our point of view, we operate in domestic demand in Europe. So from a policy point of view, there is a difference between domestic demand and external demand. And you can see it here, by the way, with exports. So the green line is exports, which, okay, in the last couple of years have been challenged, but the recovery in 21, 22 was strong. So exports in mid-22 were 10% above the pre-pandemic level, because a lot of European firms are good at making manufactured products. The car industry, the elite car industry, Mercedes, BMW, Ferrari, I suppose, and so on, they were able to sell a lot of cars at high prices in this period. People had money in their pockets. Since then, there's been, anti-trade issues, but independent, and that reflects what you said about global demand. That's true. Okay, so what's interesting is, how do we think about that surge in demand? And in particular, and I know many of you probably here are interested in the fact is, does the regime change? Do nonlinear mechanisms kick in as you get this kind of rapid increase in inflation? And that has an economic component. It has a political component as well, and a social component. And of course, these days when you can do a lot of text-based analysis using LLMs and other techniques. And what this has here is the blue dots are basically numbers of mentions of inflation in media articles. And what you see here is basically no one paying attention to inflation. The median is the orange line, or the moving. The blue dots are the range across different countries in Europe. And you can see people move from being inattentive to being attentive. And then over time, it's coming down, but it hasn't normalized all the way. But what's interesting is, when you get that change in attention, does this change inflation expectations? Do firms say, well, I can get away with a price increase because people will not blame me? They say that's just inflation. But also in terms of the political cost, in terms of suffering and so on, this surge in inflation really got people's attention very quickly. And then how did firms change? And this is a big analytical issue. Is the left side is basically and this is one of Giancarlo's co-authors, Luca Dodola, was a very important ECB. Let me go back to, I think you said at the start, the value of fundamental research. At the ECB, before this happened, there'd been a big project to go back asking, how do firms set prices? And there's a lot of use of daily price data. Honestly, at the time, I say, okay, super interesting, but basically, why are you trying to explain a number that doesn't move? It is inflation. But having done the work about understanding at a micro level how do firms set prices, then became super useful in the pandemic, because a big issue here is, it's not so much that firms change the scale of their price increase at the time when they make a change in prices. And that's part of the micro foundations issue is, by and large, firms don't want to shock their customers by a massive increase in prices. What they do is they increase the frequency of their price changes. And what you had is basically firms who might have changed prices once a year, saying, well, we need to do an extraordinary mid-year price increase. And so there is a very big nonlinearity in the data. You can see this kind of discrete jump up in the solid blue line in 2022. So it kind of, if you eyeball that, it basically doubled the price frequency. Now it's come down since then, but if you're trying to model how does inflation happen, this endogenous increase in the frequency of price setting is very important. Now, of course, one of the big forward questions is, what triggers that? How big of a shock do you need to trigger firms moving from once a year price increases to twice a year or 3 times a year price increases? And This is also reflected on the right, which is that essentially one of the ways core inflation went up is there was a much bigger response to energy prices in terms of core inflation. So core inflation has many energy using sectors. Transportation uses a lot of energy. Hotels use a lot of energy, both for kind of heating, aircon, running the kitchen and so on. And historically, when you look at input-output tables, looked at the effect of marginal cost and pricing, it wouldn't be that elastic. Firms, in other words, were prepared to let their profits absorb fluctuations in costs. The scale of the cost increase on this occasion was so big, firms could not afford to do that. They faced a bankruptcy, at the limit, you face a bankruptcy constraint. So there's a big asymmetry between price increases and price decreases. So energy prices have fallen since then. The pass-through into lower services price is not zero, but it's about half of the pass-through of the price increases. Because it's a windfall for a firm to have lower costs. An increase in cost, if it's big enough, can be existential. So a basic asymmetry between large price increases and price decreases is part of the issue. Okay, so you might say you employ all these EUI graduates at the ECB and you ask them to forecast. So why could they not work it out? And so what you see here is, if you kind of, first of all, look at the forecast errors before the pandemic, there were errors, but they were kind of more or less unbiased, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. Then we had this sequence of about a year of really, really under-predicting inflation. And this was not small. And of course, this added to the kind of dislocation in sentiment, which is, does the ECB not understand what's going on? And this is an important issue to examine. Now, since then, since late 22 onwards, the forecast errors have been tiny. So the most remarkable forecast of ECB, well, remarkable in terms of restoring normality, routine in terms of how the machine works. In December 22, when inflation was over 10%, the ECB staff predicted that inflation would be around 3% by the end of 23. So despite the 1970s discussion, despite many external people saying inflation is going to remain high, because that's what they remembered from 1970s, the ECB analysis was basically, no, it's going to be a rapid disinflation, which turned out to be, more or less on track. The last one is on GDP. The forecast errors there in the pandemic, I think it's forgivable, but basically they were more pessimistic about GDP than actually turned out to be the case. So one of the big narratives here is, how did we have such rapid disinflation while the European economy grew? Now, it didn't grow spectacularly, but it didn't have the usual sacrifice ratio that people think about. Okay, so to have a better understanding of the situation, what I do on the left is I showed at every point in time what the ECB projected to be inflation over the next couple of years. And then the solid blue line is what actually happened. And if I take, in 2021, there was a debate, but only really heated up in the autumn of 21 globally. So the fact that inflation started to pick up in the first half of 21 is still pretty low. And it's just, okay, this is just recovery from the worst of the pandemic. Second half of 21, it went above 2% in mid-21 for the ECB. But like the Fed, if you look at those kind of 2-year ahead forecasts in late 21, they were coming back to 2% or below 2%. So in other words, in late 21, there's a high conviction that essentially this is bottlenecks. The bottlenecks would ease as the economy reopened and inflation would rapidly disinflate. And what's very important is we're never going to know the answer to that, because the Russian invasion in Ukraine meant a second big shock. So, I think we share the same analysis as the Fed, which is essentially, it remains a reasonable conjecture that the 2021 inflation could have fallen away were it not for the second shock of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was already affecting the data in late 21, because of course there's a lot of pre-positioning in the gas market and so on. And then in the course of 22, you do see the ECB repeatedly having a more rapid return of inflation to target than actually happened. But as I just said, once you're at the peak, the forecasts, in fact, were pretty aligned for most of 22. And in fact, in 23, 24, the ECB's being too pessimistic. Inflation's fallen more quickly than the forecast. And it's probably, a kind of a Bayesian updating going on there where you overweight recent experiences in both directions. Okay, in terms of the big numbers, the single biggest issue is that energy prices are hard to forecast. So what you see here is the increase in energy prices, and then what we thought at different points in time. And crucially, in 21, 22, the forecast believed we were never going to see that surge in inflation. That surge was really in March to August 22. Summer 22 was totally ridiculous. August 22 was totally ridiculous about the way the European energy market works, the interaction of gas prices, electricity prices, and so on. And that element, you might say, that's just so kind of special, unique, weird, that will fall off quickly. And it did fall off fairly quickly. Now, it's important to note here is what I put in this slide is energy prices. Historically, is a pretty good predictor to look at oil prices. Oil and gas are very correlated. The transmission of oil and gas to electricity was predictable. In this world we live in, where renewables, the energy mix come in, how the wholesale pricing of energy works and so on, meant that, and also the ETS scheme, we now have people who specialize on the ETS scheme, because that also matters. So for this overall synthetic energy price, you really have to put a lot of things together. Okay, so every year we kind of put out a retrospective about where did the forecast errors come from. And if you look at if you look at, let me focus on December 21, what we thought would happen in Q1 22. So this is the where the inflation surprised about 2 percentage points in one quarter, which is quite a lot. You can see here essentially the orange box played a big role there. That's basically oil and gas prices were stronger than we expected. Now, the world is full of highly paid, probably EUI graduates whose job it is to forecast energy prices. We take the market forecast. Our assumption is we cannot do better than all of these highly paid people whose job it is to trade futures markets. And we keep on looking at that, and it's true is nothing beats it. So if you say it was obvious that oil and energy prices were going to move in a well, then I invite you to set up your own firm. So one element of that is just the forecastability element of that. The blue box is basically non-oil and gas prices feeding into energy, and the dark green is feeding into food. So food is heavily dependent on energy, fertilizer, all of that. And these other factors is, how the wholesale market works and so on. So a lot of it had to do with energy and food. The purple box at the top is basically, if you like, fundamentally modeling error, that the ECB did not project that core inflation would respond as much as it did to the surge in energy and energy and food prices. And this is where a lot of so if you, by and large, you can have a reasonable debate about should the modelers have done a better job of knowing when non-linearities will kick in. What I would say, now we've gone through this, in the virtual filing cabinet, there's going to be a playbook, okay? When we see a surge like this again, let's turn on those non-linearities. But from the point of view of 2021, 22, procedurally, what kind of evidence do you need to see before you turn those on? And essentially, it's very natural in forecasting to be a Bayesian updater. You update your priors, but partially, because there's uncertainty about what's exactly going on. And so what happened is, over time, that nonlinearity was incorporated in the forecast, but partially. So if you like, the forecasting world would say, fundamentally, a lot of this was unpredictable. But also there was a kind of under-modeling of the nonlinear consequences. Many people now have written nonlinear papers about the inflation surge. Fantastic. Helps next time. But it would have been the really far-sighted issue would have been. Now, I will tell you, actually going back, at that time, I went back, other people went back to the 1980s, the 1970s. There were a lot of relevant papers written. So if you say, well, whoever opens the QJE of 1981, whoever opens the JP of 1976, I was doing it, other people were doing it, because there was plenty of people working on energy inflation from the 1970s experience. Plenty of people working on state-dependent pricing versus time-dependent pricing. So there is kind of permanent value. JSTOR is fantastic to have all of this archive out there. In fact, other people went back even further. Okay, Ramon asked about the supply-demand decomposition, and that's also reasonable because we do need a kind of narrative about this. And if you take the peak of inflation, what this says is there was a global supply component between bottlenecks and energy was the most important issue, the red box. There was in addition, domestic supply mattered. The green is the global demand, and this is where you can pick this up from the rise in global goods prices, global energy prices, and so on. That did reflect a surge in global demand, including from the US. And then there's a kind of mauve type box, which is domestic demand. So compared to the historical average, the peak inflation rate of around 10 was 8 percentage points above the historical average. 0.8 of that 8 is domestic demand. So there was a domestic demand component to inflation, but it's not the dominant factor. So in 2021-22, the way we phrased that as the ECB, because we always said there was a demand component, but what we said was sectoral demand-supply mismatches. And I think that's the best way to think about it. So in 2021, it was basically visibly high demand for goods versus bottlenecks. Ports being bottlenecked, factories in Asia being bottlenecked, bottlenecks everywhere. So clearly visible in goods prices. In 2022, when services reopened, clearly bottlenecks in services. Many people wanted to go on holiday. not enough people to staff hotels. Many airlines had put into the parking lot some of the airplanes, not enough airplanes. Perfect time to raise prices in tourism. So we do think there was a demand component, but I think it's better phrased as
Sorry, what is the idiosyncratic?
that's what the model can't allocate to.
Residual.
Well, I mean, I think you should, you know, I could equally present by saying, well, let's distribute that idiosyncratic component to each of the underlying components. But this is just straight from the model, it's the residual. Because clearly, I mean, essentially with this kind of approach, essentially it's worse than sign restrictions. So if you see output and prices go up at the same time, that's demand. If you see prices go up and output go down compared to the benchmark, that's supply, if you like. So it's a kind of standard decomposition. And all I'll say to you is anyone who shows you a decomposition with a bigger role for demand, either they're doing the global inflation, fine, or they are not putting in enough detail to capture the sectoral element. Okay, it's very important in setting policy, not just to think about the baseline, but to think about risk. And throughout this whole period, you know, what we said in our communication, what everyone thinks about is, okay, what is the risk of expectations getting de-anchored? Because if they get de-anchored, they're going to have a long-term problem. And for a long time, so the way the ECB staff model the anchoring, again, is basically an updating model where people kind of believe the central bank target, but they also believe the data in front of them. So that there's a kind of partial updating. If inflation's too low, they say, well, okay, maybe this is going to be around for a while. So the coefficient's tiny. It's not a very big updating, but there's a little bit of updating. And I think this worked well in the low inflation period to help us understand why expectations eroded over time. And that fed into nominal wages and so on. And so if you think about this period, you know, the model of the anchoring we had still was more concerned about downward the anchoring than upward the anchoring in late 21, early 22. So if you're saying, well, why were you so slow to hike? Beyond the fact that the baseline forecast of inflation coming back to 2% and below 2% without any policy action, lurking in the background was also this fact that was still the case. At that time, there's more concern about inflation going back to the old pattern of being too low. But that changed very rapidly with the scale of the inflation surge. So you see in June 22, when we essentially flagged we're going to start a tightening cycle, the upside, the anchoring risk had gone up. And it basically has been the more important factor until quite recently. Now it's more or less two-sided again. But that is important when you think about what motivates policy. We spent a lot of time in these years saying we're going to make sure expectations don't get de-anchored to the upside. And that, you know, was also being driven by the work of the staff. One of the features, and again, when you know there's this really big surge in energy prices, and people know that's not going to last, what you want to do is say, okay, where is underlying inflation? And again, let me pause here and go back to the value of staff doing work which is not immediately relevant. Because once something becomes relevant, if you don't have the work in your filing cabinet, you can't use it because you can't get people to invent whole new techniques on the spot. So the ECB in 2018, I think before, developed a whole technique to estimate underlying inflation. What is underlying inflation? It's measures that are the best predictors of 1 year ahead inflation. or you can do 2-year ahead inflation if you want. And so you say, might say before why are you trying to predict something which is always 1%? And at the time, it didn't seem like a super interesting project. It became really relevant when inflation went up so quickly, because of course, monetary policy is forward-looking. And if we had these measures of underlying inflation saying, look, they're going to come back to 2% very quickly, then the case for hiking rates would have been weaker. And so the pre-pandemic techniques, the standard measures, if you look on the left here, is that rather than going to 10%, so 8% above the long-term average, is more like 5%, some of these measures. So it was essentially saying, and if you think about a Taylor rule basically says if inflation goes up, you hike rates more than 1-for-1. And if, when inflation was at 10 in Q4 22, it was saying, look, you should be pushing the policy rate to 11 or 12. We didn't do that. So then the discussion begins, okay, maybe you shouldn't respond to the volatile non-underlying component. Maybe you should respond to the underlying component. And that's where you get to numbers that, if you use the standard measures, you get to measures maybe like 5. But the standard measures essentially assume that core inflation is orthogonal to energy. So, and so what we did is said, well, in this context, we know there's more rapid pass-through from energy and food to core inflation. We also know core inflation is being disrupted by bottlenecks. So can you find adjusted measures? So what the team did is they ran expanded VARs where they included measures of bottlenecks and so on. And these adjusted measures said, well, actually, maybe underlying inflation is more like 4 at the peak. So for the calibration of policy, and we remember in the end, we raised rates to 4%. With a underlying equilibrium real rate around 0, 4 might have been the right number, and maybe it was. And again, this is basically applied time series econometrics being super important for policymaking. And the PCCI is the most robust measure. ECB, EUI graduates probably are not the best marketers in the world. So the New York Fed also is PCCI. They don't call it PCCI; they call it the preferred measure of underlying inflation, which is catchier for the Bloombergs of this world. Whereas PCCI, so if you're doing any work, they come up with an acronym. Pause, say, can I give this a better title? So Jean-Carlo mentioned my work with John Maria, the external wealth nations. We could have called this a data set on the net international investment position. It doesn't resonate so much. So saying, okay, this is the external wealth of nations. It's very important. So, and the PCCI has turned out to be a very good tracker. The PCCI came back to 2% very quickly. And this is the persistent and common component of inflation. And maybe going back to what Marcus said to start about fragmentation, what's interesting for this is this value in looking at country level inflation rates, not just the year averages. This is a big wide data set, which is a lot of national inflation rates. And look at the common component of that is interesting. Okay, so let me come to policy making. So the solid line here, the one solid line is what we actually did. So the question is, what should we have done according to macro models? So I have 2 slides. This is a model by some ECB staffers, Mazelis, Roberto Mato, and Risterniemi. Maybe I'll just comment here. it's hard to do monetary policy in a macro model. So this model is kind of customized to think about policy making. The next model is our standard DSG model for the EU area, which doesn't really have a kind of where policymaking is just imposed on it. Here, it's a more sophisticated way to think about policy making. In any event, what you see here is the black line is if we had the ex post data. So if you told us in autumn 21, inflation is going to go to 10% in a year from now. So that would be nice to have a time machine. We go forward and look at the actual data. So with the benefit of hindsight, this model says we would have started a rapid hiking cycle, which would have gone to over 6%. So that is an important result. The other counterfactuals is, what did the model tell you to do based on what you knew at the time in terms of your best effort in terms of the forecast? So the orange line at the bottom is what the model told us to do in December 21, which is basically, because at that time, the forecast still had inflation coming back pretty quickly to 2%. It basically said, don't do anything immediately, and maybe in the course of 22, bring the rate all the way to 0. So in December 21, we had our model saying, you should not raise rates. But you may want to think about raising rates sometime in 22. And in 21, we pre-positioned that by essentially slowing down QE and saying that the PEP program would end in March 22. Then if I move forward to the green line, which is from the point of view of June 22, well, actually, maybe, yeah, so the green line said, okay, now the forecast, so June 22 was the first time the forecast had inflation a little bit above 2% 2 years from now. So they say, okay, it's now time to move. But we think your peak, this campaign you need to do will peak out around 2% policy rate. And that's what motivated us to start. And at that point, the phrasing was, we're going to normalize interest rates, where 2% is kind of a normal value. And then later on, obviously more needs to be done. But what I would say is once we got going, what we actually did is very close to what the models told us to do. Another way of saying this is the staff work on optimal interest rates is a heavy influence on the actual decision making. Then you might say, okay, what would inflation have looked like under the counterfactual? And so if we'd raised rates from late 21 to 6%, the middle chart says inflation would have peaked around 8, not 10. So even with perfect understanding of what was about to happen, even with a much tighter monetary policy, the importance of the supply shocks meant we would have led to lower inflation, but it's not the case inflation would have been low. And under that scenario on the right, we'd have had a really big recession in 22, as opposed to a growth rate above 2%. So we'd have knocked around 3 percentage points off the growth rate of the European economy in 22. I invite you to think about now of course, to think about the financial stability implications of that, to think about the political implications in the middle of a war scenario of this very rapid tightening cycle. But in the end, it's very important. Let me skip it essentially tells a similar message with the other model. Okay, so this is a little bit similar in the sense of just looking at, again, alternative hiking cycles. And again, the message here is essentially inflation. We could have brought inflation down a bit, but realistic early tightening hypotheses wouldn't have made maybe a massive difference. So again, there's a lot of people saying, oh, you should have hiked in, let's say, March 22 rather than summer 22. But the basic point is, being late by a quarter or 2 quarters does not make much difference in a macro model. And in March 22, and I've written about this, the Ukraine war had just happened. We did a scenario analysis. We published a scenario analysis, which did have inflation going up nearly to 10%. We did publish it, this might happen. But we didn't act upon it because is also the case in some of these scenarios, the macro and financial cost of the war could have been high. So the fact we delayed from like March 22 to July 22, maybe in the context of the war, has to be taken into account. Now, one of the big narratives we've had for the last 2 years, and it's in every monetary policy statement, is our calibration of policy would depend on the incoming evidence on the strength of monetary transmission. And the point I want to make here is this has different models we use at the ECB. The impact of monetary policy differs quite a bit across these models. So in calibrating policy, do you want to put all your bets on one of these models? It's because even within the modeling group of the ECB, there's very different estimates. So what we said is we're going to be empirical about it. And this is why we put so much emphasis on looking at the bank lending survey, looking at the SAFE, the Survey on Access to Finance for Enterprises, looking at credit dynamics and so on, because macro models have a hard time dealing with monetary policy. Why is that? Some basics for the modelers here. One is, how forward-looking are people? Because if you have if people, when they saw us hike rates, if they understood the macro model, which is often a core assumption in the model, that people understand what's about to happen, they say, oh my God, rates are going to go to 4% over the next year. I need to really cut my consumption today. Whereas if you have other people that are more kind of delayed in their response, and then if you throw in how many people are kind of, hand-to-mouth consumers, and there's no ex-ante reason to say this model is perfect, that model I reject. Because it's also the case with the change from being inattentive to attentive, maybe a lot of people became more forward-looking than they were before. So what we do at the ECB is we run a range of models. And honestly, and you see it here, we often look at the mean or median response across the models. Because to say, you know for sure which model is going to be the best case is not so obvious. So this goes back to, we need theory, we need really good models. Because especially when you have situations which are not in the data set, using the rigor of models to work through the dynamics is very important. You also need a little bit of empirics. And maybe that's it. I'm happy to. So what I've tried to do is essentially walk you through meeting by meeting, quarter by quarter, what were the set of issues that we faced. We tried to do a lot ourselves in terms of looking back. There's lots of working papers you can read. I've done a couple of retrospective essays, but of course, you shouldn't only listen to us. There's other people should be also doing this kind of ex post review. The only thing I'll say there is some people do back of the envelope type reviews, and that's not serious. So you need to do it in a good way.
Okay, let's start. I think it was a fascinating deconstruction of what happened, what you have done. So we are open for now. We open the floor. Can I start with two questions, and then maybe we collect some. We had to find a way to get also the colleagues on the line if they want to put forward some questions. Maybe Odysseus, when you see the thing, take the floor. Okay, I have.
We are a bit late, so we need to ask everybody. We are a bit late. We need to ask everybody to be short in their question.
Yeah. Okay. I have two questions basically. Okay. One thing, if I ask around, one term you have not used throughout the whole speech. I think we could do a survey. I spot one, R*. Never mentioned. However, if I take I think the first or the second slide that you had, I would conclude that it's 0 in your estimates. Is this the ballpark? So that's my first question. The second question is excellent combination between the apportioning of the inflation spike to different typologies of shocks, and looking at that together with the optimal policy reasoning. Now, I have two sub-questions on this. Okay, the first one is that how do you place non-conventional policies in that, in the optimal? And I mean, we have had since the very beginning, the message coming from Frankfurt is that first we end the non-conventional, and then we start the hype. I wonder whether that is something that on an ex post fashion you would consider the right sequencing or not, and whether indeed that kind of sequencing may not have led to some, let's say, some delay in the conventional part. And finally, Marcello and myself, we wrote at that time, I think 21, 22, we wrote a paper proposing, looking at the shocks at the time. It was, I think we did not have obviously the kind of granular distinction that you have now, but we attributed a lot to a supply shock, and we advocated what we call the counter supply shock coming from policy, which would shift the supply curve to the right, having followed the negative supply shock, bringing it to the left. And it seems to me that what you argue and what you find here in terms of optimal policy actually vindicates that type of assessment there. Whether that would have been feasible or not, but clearly I think it would have helped a lot. I think to have the fiscal policy turned from looking at the more oriented to the demand side, actually focusing more on how to engineer the supply side development.
You want to take some more before giving to Marcello? Ramon. Marcello.
Yes, thank you first for an excellent talk. I mean, I think that shows that the ECB has been very lucky of having you. I mean, I hardly ever seen such a speak relating the research done, most of it at the ECB, linking to the policy that is done. On the other hand, you also have been a lucky man. You just mentioned it. You were at Harvard then, not now, for example. So just very short questions. The ECB was also fairly criticized in the 2010 for being too slow in reaction. And I think that instead now seems, and part of the talk I get out of it, has learned quite a lot to react faster, whether you agree on that statement or not. And ECB in your first slide looks astonishing, okay, powerful. But then you go to the next slide, and it looks that in these 25 years that have been celebrated, and Giancarlo and Mark organized things about it, has also aged. So it's this fat balance sheet, like an old man who has a hard time to get rid of it. So how do you see this? It is okay? It's healthy, or what can be done about it?
Can you take more or you want to? So I will do Marcello and Bartrao again.
Marcello Messori, Robert Schuman Center. Thank you very much. Your presentation was really very stimulating, and I would like to address three specific points. The first is a marginal elaboration on the last question raised by Marco. Me too, I was struck by the fact that apparently you share the idea that a fiscal counter shock should be quite useful to help not to leave ECB too alone in handling the excessive inflation. Nevertheless, we know very well the answer given by European institutions, that is, well, Next Generation EU is the possible fiscal counter shock. Nevertheless, you showed us a figure, and analyzing the dynamics of GDP, the consumption investment components did not have a good dynamics. Hence, we can state that RRF didn't work. Which is your opinion on this point? My second point relates to the so-called errors in the ECB projections. My expectation was that it was quite obvious that there was an error in terms of energy and foods prices. Nevertheless, I was struck by the importance of the residual component. And my question is, do you think that there is a correlation between the idiosyncratic component of inflation rate and the weight of the residual component in terms of forecast errors? My last question relates to your figure on the anchoring of the expectations. My interpretation is that we didn't have a structure of the anchoring. Nevertheless, I would be very interested in knowing if ECB has a critical threshold to state to analyze the problem. Thank you very much.
Just briefly, in a way, I put it provocatively because I also enjoyed how you decomposed all these thoughts that have to go into inflation projections. But if one is not an economist and would ask, why on earth do you put so much effort into getting increasingly every component out on which you could be wrong, because they're too volatile to predict, in order to come up with correct inflation projections, that the markets then may guess what happens to these other components that may drive wage dynamics, price setting dynamics, and so on. So at some point, there is a question, to whom is all this addressed? And why would you not, for example, put much more effort into predicting energy prices and food prices, which could become ever more important as climate change materializes, instead of these kind of exercises? Thank you.
This point. Anybody below 30? Oh, there, sir. No, there is.
That's the way
Thank you so much for this presentation. Was very interesting, but what I missed, and maybe you can address it if you like, is this argument that major root cause behind this inflation surge that we had was this gridflation, the seller's inflation argument. To what extent do you try to factor in this this story into your estimates? And if it was the case, was it properly addressed by the interest hikes of the ECB?
It's a disappointment for Phil if no student from economics ask any question to say. So we cannot disappoint Phil. He will not come back again.
Have here. So there is, and we also happy to join the industry of trying to estimate the equilibrium real rate. And the staff once a year put out a kind of estimate. And as Marco indicated, and this is a year system estimate, by the way, because it takes not just the ECB work, it takes the Bundesbank, all the national central banks, and maybe, again, for those of you who think about jobs in the future, a big trend in the ECB in recent years has been to recognize that the skill level across all the national central banks has gone up quite a bit. So basically, a lot of the work is essentially, okay, you've got a good guy at the Latvian central bank, the Lithuanian, wherever. So the estimates, landed between 175 for the nominal neutral, 175 and 225. The midpoint being 200, expected inflation of 2, real rate of 0. Now we try to say, okay, that's interesting, that's nice, but we're not in the neutral world. So the movement of the interest rate from -50 to 400, you can spend a little bit of time saying how much of that reflects a change in the long-term rate, the equilibrium rate. It's mostly going to be cyclical, moving around. The market has to think about this for their long-term anchor. I do think it's striking. I'm not so sure it's a change in or star. The fact that before the pandemic, they were convinced that essentially the long-term policy rate would be 0 or below, which sounds like a very negative real rate. The other version is just we need a lot of monetary accommodation for a long time. And that was really suppressing, which goes to the balance sheet question, which I'll come to. Then the non-conventional policy issue is there's a logic to saying you're going to end QE before you start raising rates. But what I would say is we do think QE mostly works through the announcement, not the kind of implementation. So if you announce over the next year, we're going to spend X amount on assets, and by the way, today we're raising rates, that probably wouldn't make much of a difference. So fundamentally, Marco, the issue was our forecast did not have inflation at 2% until the June 22 forecast. The moving earlier than that, we could have done on a risk basis, but the Ukraine war was a counter reason. More generally, the question is, every day I'm reinforcing this. Once you start raising rates, that's the policy you use. It's much more effective if you want to tighten loosen policy to raise or lower the policy rate than to speed up or slow down QE or QT. And this is why, there will be a debate at some point in the future about where's the landing zone for the balance sheet. But the basic reason why we're not selling, we're just letting it run off, is basically what do we get if we start to sell? And we think it's inefficient to do so. There's a lot of debt issuance going on. So that number, which looks like it's falling slowly, as a share of the bond market is coming down. The long-term question, which is also for the Fed, is after the global financial crisis, the most liquid asset in the world is central bank reserves. There's no valuation risk. It's a fantastic asset for banks. They want a lot of it. The question is, how much of it should we supply? And it's not really a kind of monetary policy issue. It's kind of a kind of market technical issue. Here I focus on monetary policy. I think there was a lot of pro-supply effort. So if you remember the Russia-Ukraine war here in Germany, how can Germany get away from such a great dependence on Russian oil? Here in Italy, I think Mario Draghi found, was it Algeria somewhere? So basically, the search to find alternative energy supplies was a massive effort, not by us, but by governments across Europe and all the different answers. But it was not a trivial pro-supply side policy to find alternative energy. Maybe more can be done. A really big topic for research is in 2022, at the end of 22, there was about 3 percentage points of European GDP, a lot, spent on anti-inflation measures by governments. So whether that was capping a given energy price, having a temporary reduction in VAT, direct income support is a lot. One reason why inflation is now a little bit high in some countries is some of those measures are reversing. So we've seen tax increases and end of subsidies, which is pushing up inflation a little bit. But if the overall message is the ECB has its job, but the job is a lot easier if governments expand supply in the right way, absolutely. The whole architecture, and this goes back to, and going back to the EMU Lab, our ability to do monetary policy in a straightforward way is so much easier when the euro area architecture has improved. We have the ESM, we have next generation EU. We have many elements which back in 2010 was not there. You know, so I think it's the ability of the ECB to be a normal central bank has just gone up a lot with all of that. And in terms of the balance sheet, it is an open question where the steady state is for this issue about, you know, what is the role of the central bank in providing liquidity in a world that's changing in terms of the financial system. The idiosyncratic component of inflation which another way of saying, you know, what are the limits of models? You know, it's a non-model component. So what I say is a lot of what we do is say, I don't really know or care why inflation is high, but when inflation is high, it absolutely has its own momentum, going through wage dynamics and going through pricing decisions. So what was interesting at the time is profits went up at the start of inflation, quite visibly. Some of this was a windfall. Utility companies, because of the way the electricity pricing works, with the marginal cost, not the average cost, lots of utility companies made so much money. Firms in the goods sector, which are responding to high global demand, the share prices of the car industry went way up, even though they were producing less. And also and most fundamentally, wages respond very slowly. So firms raised prices, labor costs did not go up, so profits were relatively high. We knew, and we emphasized, is for the next several years, the way inflation would come down, despite wages going up, is profits would have to compress. And that's partly for us, that we say demand is going to be restrictive. You're going to be dealing with rising costs, but you're not going to be able to raise prices because demand is restrictive. Firms, by the way, in the equilibrium, firms knew this. So I better make really big price increases at the start because I'm expecting my costs to go up over time, because over time, wages increase. Going back to the nature of the euro, labor market institutions differ so much across countries. Belgium has legal inflation indexation. Wages went up quickly in Belgium. A really interesting pair to maps is Austria and Germany. Austria, it's once a year wage resetting, so pretty rapid. Germany, 3-year wage contracts are pervasive. You had in Germany last year, people who had not got a wage, their last wage contract was signed in 21 before inflation went up. They waited 3 years to have wages. So last year, German wages went up quite a bit, but that was a big catch up from the, famously, Mike Woodford, in terms of what are the costs of inflation, it's relative price distortions. the biggest relative price distortion is the relative price of labor. In a world where unemployment is very low, we had a big decline in real wages. You say, how does that work? How can unemployment be dropping and workers unable to exert their labor market power? And this is just because labor market institutions are so strong. The exception, by the way, is minimum wage. Minimum wage, governments knew in the world of populism, they had to raise minimum wages quickly, which they did. So there's also big compression in wages in this time period because people at the bottom were protected through essentially indexation of minimum wages. So the labor, I know I've met some of you who are working in labor markets, tons of labor market questions to ask. I know lots of people here are also working on monetary fiscal interactions, a lot of issues there. But there's a new layer to that, which happened here, not in the US. In the US, there was no fiscal response to high inflation. There was a fiscal response to the pandemic, but in terms of saying to people, we're going to protect you from this cost of living increase. That was widespread in Europe. It was not there in the US. One interesting hypothesis is in France, they worked hard to suppress peak inflation by having a lot of subsidies. On the theory, if you suppress the peak, then the second round of wage increases are going to be less, and the inflation headaches are going to be less. France has a much less inflation problem than some other countries, partly because of this. So the whole fiscal monetary agenda, the cost side for the economy is also something to look at carefully. Very good.
I think we are out of time, but in the interest of students from economics, questions, anybody? While they're thinking, I'm glad that you make these comments because the obvious question is when is the disinflation cycle be over? And you already addressed this more than when, which is difficult to ask. What are the dynamics you expect? I think part you already addressed this. Okay, can I add two elements? One element is there's been a sense in which fiscal policy has been very, very strong and it may change sign. That, I guess, could be part of the issue. And the second thing is, of course, the change in international relations, specifically the challenge for the euro of a very strong fiscal expansion in the US, raising all sorts of issues about the dollar, the attractiveness of investment there, and also bringing in another element which was thought important in the negative. It may be important now in the positive, which is global inflation. I mean, if there is a strong increase in inflation in the US, whether we are enough insulated from it or you see problems that may come from it.
Very, very good. So I think and our communication is probably saying for the last 3 years, it's been dominated about we will bring inflation back to 2%. That, I think, conditional on no new shocks, we're at the point that, yeah, inflation, it's not quite done. Services inflation has come down a little bit more. By the way, going back to empirics, one reason why we're in more solid footing on that is across the euro area, we now have this kind of wage contract data set. So we know what people are signing for this year, next year, the year after. So in terms of being able to forecast wage inflation, we have a much stronger perspective. And we're seeing wage contracts having actually quite low settlements for this year, even lower for next year and so on. So we are confident service inflation will calm down. But as you just said, it's not a world of no shocks. So what we're repositioning, saying, look, that's over, but we have new shocks. This year we've seen a big movement in the exchange rate, a big movement in energy prices, and lurking behind everything is the global trading system. On fiscal, one of the reasons why inflation was so low before the pandemic was a really tight fiscal policy for 10 years. So the average fiscal balance in Europe was below 1% before the pandemic. Now it's around -3. There's a lot of concern with the new fiscal framework that people would bring it down from -3 to -2, -1. And how would Europe handle that amount of fiscal adjustment? What we have now is -3, more or less, open-endedly. And so the question, maybe from a macro point of view, the government leaning against precautionary saving and nervous investors in the area by providing a stable amount of domestic demand is maybe okay. Then the question is, what is the connection between inflation in America and inflation here? I mean, the number one thing to say is, in the end, this is a euro-denominated economy. It's not a dollar-denominated economy. With floating exchange rates, there's nothing mechanical linking inflation here with the US. What we think in the end with Fed policy is the kind of medium-term impact is directionally the same. So if the Fed tightens policy, over a couple of years, it lowers inflation in Europe. In the immediate term, it may not, because if the Fed tightens policy, the euro may weaken and raise inflation. But we think the bigger effect is, if the Fed tightens policy, the world economy slows down. That weakens European export demand around the world. It lowers commodity prices. And if the Fed tightens policy at the long end of the yield curve, investors switch from euro bonds to dollar bonds, and that also tightens. So we do, obviously, we would calibrate our policy depending on that. So that's there. But again, because of the fact, we compare about inflation here in Europe, denominated in euro, it's important to remember inflation is under our control. So the global inflation concept is not totally well-founded. There's a difference about pricing strategies. One of the issues in the papers this week is some firms are saying the tariff increase in America, we're going to just increase our global price. This, again, may happen in some industries, but in other industries, they're saying the tariff increase in America, we'll raise our American price, but other markets have other dynamics. So let's see.
Had you had your decomposition in terms of typology of shocks? I mean, for the US, the impact of the domestic demand shock would be huge, no?
Yeah. Need to close unless there is very little over time. I would like to finish with a seemingly nerdy comment. First of all, we haven't talked about tariff and the geopolitical risk, but one thing at a time, and I think it was included in all this discussion, part of the discussion about the disinflation. But the nerdy comment is the fact that sectoral shock, relative price, all these define the idea that basically being open to international consideration in macro is very important. I have to confess that this year the international macro has been extremely crowded in the EUI. Many of the concepts that are slowly going into monetary economics as central banks are actually concepts that were developed over time of people working on global models, international macro models. This is important because, again, there will be at some point a recomposition of relative price, including the level of wages that needs to, at one point, come to some equilibrium that cannot be, suffering a 20% decrease in real terms. At one point, there will be a alignment in relative prices. But even the aspect of the idea that every shock, every policy measure has both a demand and a supply component is something that internationally is very clear. It has become extremely important in the last few years. My favorite example, and I close with this, if the massive income support in the US was a demand policy, but it created a supply problem because many people resigned. Many of the shocks like COVID had a demand and a supply component. I think this is a world in which these two components will always show up in the graphs of the ECB in the future. So I think we could join with a round of applause. Applause again for. So thank you very much for participating.